Once you have a shooting board and hand plane all tuned up, you're going to use it all the time because you're going to get really smooth and perfectly square cuts in all your projects, and that's going to allow you to take your woodworking projects to the next level. The rabbet, or the track that the plane rides in, needs to be at least 2 inches wide. I've decided that 22 inches will be the total length of my shooting board. The other critical measurement I need to know is how thick the top needs to be, and that's determined by where the blade starts cutting. So for my plane, about 3/8 of an inch to 1/2 an inch is good for the thickness of the top. Next, it's just a matter of roughing out the MDF pieces on the table saw. Now it's time to glue up all the panels for the base of the shooting board. It takes a lot of glue, and I'm using an artist brayer to spread out the glue, and I'm applying glue to both mating surfaces so that I don't get glue starvation. The next step is to rip the blank for the fence to rough width at the bandsaw. I never rip rough lumber at the table saw because there's too much risk of kickback. I do all my rough ripping at the bandsaw. I'm also roughing out the cleat for the front of the shooting board so that it hooks on the front of the bench. Next, it's over to the joiner to join 2 edges of the cleat and fence to make them straight, flat, and perfectly 90 degrees from each other. Next, it's over to the surface planer to plane the sides that are opposite to those that were surfaced on the joiner. With the fence all prepared and the cleat all prepared, let's get them put on the shooting board. Action! I'm clamping the cleat in place. Now I'm pre-drilling and countersinking for 4 screws. Let's apply the glue to the cleat. Now don't skimp, because this cleat is what's providing the equal and opposite reaction to the force applied by the hand plane. Glue and screws are what's in order for high stress parts and shop projects. Now let's screw the cleat in place. I use a clamp to make sure I get a tight glue joint. Clean up the glue squeeze out with a damp paper towel. Now, despite my efforts to keep the cleat flush with the front edge, it protrudes a little. So I'm going to clean it up with a hand plane. Since the one end protrudes a little more than the other, I start planing at that end to remove a little more from that end. And then I flush the whole thing with a few more strokes. Now I'm going to hand plane all 4 edges of the fence to just make sure they're all just straight and perfectly smooth, and any snipe left from the planer is gone. Now that I've hand planed all 4 edges of the fence, I'm going to check it with a square to make sure that it's just dead and perfectly square. If it's not, I can adjust that with the hand plane. Now, even though that looked perfectly square, something told me that I needed to put a little backlight on this and double check it. And sure enough, put a little backlight behind here and we can see that this fence is not actually perfectly square. It's off a few thousandths of an inch, so I'm going to square this up with the hand plane. In order to square up the fence, I need to make a slightly angled cut on the bottom side with the hand plane. I do this by making a cut that leaves the far left edge uncut, and that leaves it higher than the rest of the part that I just cut. I then make 2 more full width passes. One side of the plane rides on the high ridge that wasn't cut, and the other side rides the lower part of the cut. This establishes a new angle, and I did this 3 times to get the fence perfectly square. In order to control the hand plane as I need to establish the high ridge on this cut, I wrap my fingers over and around the end of the hand plane so that I run them along the edge of the board, acting like a fence. Using the backlight again, we can now see that this fence is perfectly square, and that tiniest little bit of light you see near the center is probably a fraction of a thousandth of an inch. I screwed the fence in place at this end, which will act as a pivot point, and I've clamped the other end in place using the square I tested earlier. This is a good starting point for testing to see if the fence is square. I prepared 2 pieces of masonite to test the fence for square. I'll shoot both pieces and then flip one over, which doubles any error the fence might have. By using a known square, I got this perfect the first time. If my square had been off, I would have adjusted the clamped end of the fence and retested until I eliminated any error. I put a couple more screws in the fence and removed the clamp. I then repeat the test on the masonite test pieces to make sure the fence is still perfect, and it is. Now that the fence is perfectly square to the hand plane track, I need to check if the cut is perfectly square to the face of the workpieces, or basically that it's cutting plumb. So I'm going to test it for square as the plane is now, and I kind of suspect that it's not going to be square. So you probably can't see it here, but I can see it in the light. And the edge of this is just a little out of square with the sole. To square the side of the plane, I'm going to use 150 grit self-adhesive sandpaper on my table saw. I'll use the rip fence, which is perfectly square to the blade, to run the bed of the plane on while sanding the side of the plane so that I get the edge perfectly square in relation to the sole. I've retracted the blade so that it won't make contact with the rip fence. I'm making sure to apply nearly equal pressure against the rip fence and the sandpaper. If I don't keep this square while sanding, I could really mess this plane up. I move the fence to expose new sandpaper. This 150 grit cuts cast iron pretty well, but it does wear out quickly. And by the way, rougher grit paper won't cut cast iron quicker, kind of like it does on wood. 150 grit is the sweet spot for cast iron. It took me a total of 5 minutes to square up the side, and I consider this time very well spent. To check it for square, I reshot the test piece and used the square and backlighting. The time spent to get this hand plane and shooting board all tuned up is just so worth it. If you'd like to see me use this hand plane and the shooting board I just made in this video to make an actual project, watch the video queued up on top. Otherwise, watch the video that YouTube has selected on the bottom.